The silence in a big house after losing the love of your life is unbearable. Clara Whitmore knew this better than anyone as she wandered the empty halls of her 20-room mansion at 63. Her husband was gone. Her children lived there, own lives in distant cities. The house that once held so much joy now felt like a beautiful prison. Clara had called the realtor that morning to sell everything. But when Jack Patterson appeared at her gates that evening, everything changed. This weathered man with kind eyes had been homeless for 8 years. His simple words, "I haven't had a home in 8 years," stirred something deep in Clara's heart. She saw the same loneliness in his eyes that she carried every day. Her late husband always said they should never let a good soul go without shelter. What happened next would change both their lives forever. But would giving her entire mansion to a stranger heal them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Whitmore's morning ritual had become a dance of avoidance. She would rise at 7, make coffee for one, and deliberately avoid looking at the family portrait that dominated the entrance hall. The oil painting showed her complete family. From 15 years ago, Robert's arm around her waist. Their 3 children gathered close, all of them younger and full of the certainty that this moment would last forever. Now the portrait served only as a reminder of how scattered they had all become. The mansion stretched around her like a museum of memories. 23 rooms, each one echoing with the ghosts of laughter, arguments, celebrations, and quiet moments that had shaped 4 decades of marriage. Robert had bought this house when they were 30, convinced that its grandeur would provide the perfect backdrop for the large, boisterous family they planned to raise. "We'll fill every room with love," he had promised. Kissing her forehead as they stood in the empty foyer on moving day. They had filled it, for a time. Birthday parties in the great room, Christmas mornings around the massive tree in the living room, teenage gatherings that spilled from the kitchen into the garden. But children grow up, and dreams evolve, and slowly the house had emptied until only Clara and Robert remained, rattling around in spaces too large for their quieter love. Then Robert was gone too, and Clara discovered that silence could be deafening. Her phone rang at 8:30. The same time every Tuesday morning. She knew without looking that it would be her eldest daughter, Margaret, calling from Seattle, where she worked as a pharmaceutical executive. "Mom, how are you holding up?" Margaret's voice carried the careful tone of someone managing a difficult client. "I'm fine, dear. Just having my coffee and thinking about tackling the garden today." Clara settled into Robert's reading chair, the leather worn smooth by years of his presence. "You know you don't have to maintain that enormous property yourself. We've talked about this. There are wonderful retirement communities. I'm 63, Margaret, not 93. I know, but Mom, be practical. That house is too much for anyone to handle alone. The property taxes alone must be enormous." Clara let her daughter's voice wash over her while she studied the garden through the window. Robert's roses had grown wild and unruly, their blooms smaller and more scattered than when he tended them with such devotion. She should hire a gardener, but the thought of explaining Robert's careful system to a stranger felt overwhelming. "Are you listening, Mom?" "Of course, dear. I said David and I are thinking about flying out next month. We can help you start going through Dad's things. Maybe contact some realtors. I've already called a realtor." Silence stretched across the continent. "You have?" "Yesterday. She's coming Thursday to do a walk-through." "Mom, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you for taking this step. It's the right thing to do. The right thing to do." Clara wondered when her life had become a series of right things to do rather than things she wanted to do. After they ended the call, she received similar conversations from her son Michael in Denver and her youngest daughter Sarah in Boston. All 3 of them relieved, supportive. and entirely absent from the reality of her daily existence. She spent the afternoon in Robert's study, which she had left untouched since his death 18 months ago. His reading glasses still lay folded on the desk, beside a biography of Theodore Roosevelt he would never finish. His coffee mug sat beside his computer, a ring of dried residue marking where his morning routine had ended forever. The realtor, Linda Chun, arrived Thursday morning in a Mercedes and a navy suit that spoke of expensive success. She walked through the mansion with the efficient eye of someone who saw square footage and market value rather than memories and heartbreak. "It's a stunning property," Linda said, making notes on her tablet as they stood in the master bedroom. "The bones are excellent, the location is prime. And honestly, Mrs. Whitmore, in this market, you're sitting on a gold mine. I'm thinking we list at $2.8 million and see what happens." Clara nodded, though the number felt abstract. She had never thought of her home in terms of millions. It was simply the place where she and Robert had built their life. "The only potential issue is the maintenance," Linda continued, opening closet doors and photographing the walk-in wardrobe. "Buyers in this price range expect everything to be perfect. That garden needs professional attention, and I noticed some wear on the hardwood floors in the dining room. My husband always maintained everything himself. I'm sure he did. But we want to maximize your return on investment. I can recommend some contractors. That won't be necessary. I'll handle it." After Linda left, Clara walked through her home, seeing it through a stranger's eyes for the first time. The worn spots on the Persian rug were Robert paced during phone calls. The slight scuff marks on the dining room floor from decades of chair legs. The garden that had become a testament to neglect rather than love. Her volunteer work at St. Mary's Church provided her only regular social contact, serving lunch to those less fortunate every Wednesday and Friday. It was there, ladling soup and listening to stories of hardship, that Clara had first begun to understand the weight of her solitude. These people, the elderly, the unemployed, the forgotten, they spoke to each other with genuine warmth. They shared their meager resources and celebrated small victories together. Clara envied their connections, even as she wrote checks to support their needs. Evening brought the loneliest hour. She would sit in the dining room designed for 12, eating meals prepared for one. The chandelier cast elegant light over empty chairs, and Clara would sometimes catch herself setting 2 places out of habit before remembering that Robert would not be joining her. The house settled around her with creaks and sighs that had once comforted her as signs of home, but now felt like symptoms of decay. 23 rooms, and she used perhaps 5 of them regularly. The rest existed as shrines to a life that had moved on without her. Some nights, she would stand at her bedroom window and look out over the grounds, wondering what Robert would think of her decision to sell. They had planned to grow old here, together, to welcome grandchildren for holidays and summer visits. Instead, she was preparing to abandon the dream they had built together, trading it for something smaller and more manageable. But as she prepared for bed each night, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was not just selling a house. She was surrendering the last tangible connection to the man she had loved for 41 years, and to the woman she had been when that love made anything seem possible. Jack Patterson had been standing at the iron gates for 20 minutes, gathering courage he wasn't sure he possessed. The mansion beyond rose like something from a different world, cream-colored stone. Tall windows catching the late afternoon sun, gardens that whispered of wealth and permanence. This was exactly the kind of place where his presence would be unwelcome, where security systems and neighborhood watch programs existed specifically to keep people like him at a safe distance. But desperation had a way of making cowards brave. The work-worn toolbox at his feet represented everything he had left of his former life. Hammers and screwdrivers, a level that had helped him build straight walls for 30 years. wood chisels that had shaped countless pieces of trim and molding. The tools were clean and organized, maintained with the obsessive care of a craftsman who understood that his instruments were extensions of his hands, his identity, his worth. 8 years of homelessness had not broken that habit. Even when he had nothing else, Jack kept his tools ready. He had been walking the neighborhood for hours, looking for work that would pay cash fence repairs, gutter cleaning, anything that would put $20 in his pocket for food. The residential streets here were lined with houses that clearly needed maintenance, but they were also the kind of places where strangers were viewed with suspicion. The mansion had drawn his attention because of the garden. From the street, he could see that the roses needed pruning, the hedges had grown unruly, and the stone walkway was cracked in several places. It was the kind of work he could do well if given the chance. Through the gates, he caught sight of movement at an upstairs window. A woman, older, with silver hair pulled back neatly. She stood looking out at the garden with an expression he recognized, the look of someone overwhelmed by a task too large to manage alone. Jack knew that look intimately. He had seen it in mirrors during the final months of his old life, when Sarah's medical bills mounted faster than his income, when the business began to fail, when everything he had built started crumbling around him. The woman at the window moved away, and Jack almost walked on. Almost. But something in her posture, the slight slump of shoulders carrying too much weight, made him reconsider. He had been that person once. Maybe he could help. He pressed the intercom button beside the gate. The voice that answered was cautious but polite. "Yes. Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you. I was walking by and noticed your garden could use some attention. I'm a handyman and I was wondering if you might need any work done." Silence stretched long enough that Jack wondered if she had simply walked away. Then, "I'm not looking for any services right now." "I understand. I just thought, well, I know good work when I see it, and someone put a lot of love into that garden originally. It would be a shame to let it go." Another pause. "Are you from around here?" The question was delicate, and Jack understood what she was really asking. "Are you safe? Are you legitimate? Are you the kind of person I can trust near my home?" "No, ma'am. I'm just passing through looking for honest work. I can show you references if you'd like, or you can check my tools." A man's tools will tell you a lot about his character. This time, when she spoke, there was something different in her voice. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition of something genuine. "What kind of work do you do?" "Carpentry, mostly. General maintenance. I've been doing it for 30 years. I know gardens. To learn it from my wife. She had a way with roses." "Had?" The single word hung in the air between them. Jack closed his eyes, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Sarah entered the conversation. "She passed away 9 years ago. Cancer. I'm sorry." "Thank you." The intercom went quiet again, but this time Jack sensed contemplation rather than dismissal. He waited, studying the intricate ironwork of the gates, the way the afternoon light played through the trees lining the driveway. "What's your name?" "Jack Patterson, ma'am." "Mr. Patterson, I'm Clara Whitmore." Her voice caught slightly, and when she continued, she sounded older, more fragile. "I'm sorry. I don't usually, I'm not in the habit of talking to strangers through the gate. I understand. These days, you can't be too careful. It's not that. It's just, when did you say you lost your wife?" 9 years ago this October. I lost my husband 18 months ago. The admission settled between them with the weight of shared understanding. Jack felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of kinship that transcended their obvious differences in circumstance. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Whitmore." "Thank you." "And yours." They stood in silence, she somewhere beyond the gates, he on the sidewalk with his toolbox. Two people united by grief and separated by wrought iron and social convention. "Mr. Patterson?" Yes, ma'am. When you said you were passing through where? Are you staying? The question he'd been dreading. Jack looked down at his tools, at his clothes that were clean, but showed the wear of too many washes, at the small backpack that contained everything else he owned. I haven't had a home in 8 years. The words came out quietly, without self-pity, but with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by his circumstances. He had learned not to elaborate, not to explain the sequence of events that led from being a successful contractor to standing homeless at the gates of a mansion. People didn't want those details, but something in the silence that followed felt different. Not judgment or dismissal, but something deeper, understanding, maybe, or recognition. 8 years, she repeated softly. Yes, ma'am. Since my wife died, and well, things got complicated after that. Where do you sleep? The question was asked with genuine concern, not the curiosity of someone collecting gossip. I manage. There are shelters, and when the weather's good, there are safe places outdoors. I don't cause trouble, and I always move on when asked. That's no way to live. No, ma'am, it's not. But it's the way things are. Another long pause. Jack was about to apologize for bothering her and move on when he heard the sound of the gate mechanism engaging. The iron barriers swung open with a smooth, quiet motion. Clara Whitmore stood in the driveway 20 feet away. She was smaller than he had expected, wearing dark slacks and a cream-colored blouse, her silver hair styled simply. Her eyes were kind, but carried the particular sadness that comes with deep loss. Mr. Patterson, would you like some coffee? I was just about to make a pot. Jack stared at her, certain he had misunderstood. Ma'am? Coffee. And maybe you could tell me more about what you see in my garden. He picked up his toolbox with hands that weren't entirely steady. Are you sure? I mean, you don't know me. No, I don't. But I know loneliness when I see it. And I know that sometimes taking a chance on kindness is the only thing that keeps us human. As Jack walked through the gates toward the mansion, toward this woman who had just extended more trust than he had received in years, he wondered if she had any idea that her simple invitation had just changed everything. The guest bedroom, on the second floor of the Whitmore mansion, was larger than any apartment Jack had lived in during his married years. Crystal lamps cast warm light over furniture that belonged in magazines, and the bed was draped in linen so fine they seemed to whisper against his work-roughened hands. He sat on the edge of the mattress, afraid to disturb the careful arrangement of pillows, and wondered what he was doing here. Clara had shown him to the room after their coffee stretched into dinner, after their conversation meandered through gardens and grief, after she had made the impulsive decision that still left. Then, both slightly stunned, "You can stay the night," she had said as darkness settled over the grounds. "It's too late to be walking around looking for shelter." Jack had protested, of course. He had tried to explain that he was accustomed to taking care of himself, that he didn't want to impose, that she owed him nothing. But Clara had been quietly insistent, and the prospect of sleeping in a real bed, with a roof overhead and no concern about security or weather, had been impossible to resist. Now, alone in luxury that felt surreal, Jack unpacked his meager possessions onto the mahogany dresser. A change of clothes, toiletries, a photograph of Sarah taken on their 20th wedding anniversary. The image showed her laughing at something he had said, her face bright with the joy that had made every day of their marriage feel like a gift. He had been carrying her picture for 9 years, through the gradual dissolution of everything they had built together. Through the months when medical bills consumed their savings, when the construction business failed because he couldn't focus on work while watching his wife die by degrees. Through the foreclosure proceedings and the awkward conversations with friends who didn't know how to help. Through the first nights in his truck, then the shelters, then the gradual acceptance that this was simply who was now. But tonight, In this room that smelled of lavender and comfort, Jack allowed himself to remember the man he had been when Sarah was alive. The contractor who took pride in his work, who built things that would last, who came home every evening to a woman, who made him laugh and made him whole. He placed the photograph on the nightstand and tried to imagine what Sarah would think of this moment. She had always been the one to trust strangers, to offer help before it was asked for, to see possibilities where he saw only problems. You would have liked her, he whispered to the picture. You would have told me to stop worrying and just say thank you. Sleep came easier than it had in months. Morning brought anxiety disguised as practicality. Jack woke early, showered carefully, and made the bed with military precision. He found Clara in the kitchen, standing at the window with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint her garden in shades of gold and amber. "Good morning," she said without turning around. "There's coffee, and I was thinking about making eggs." "Mrs. Whitmore, I want to thank you for your kindness last night, but I should probably what?" Jack studied her profile, the way morning light softened the lines around her eyes. "Should probably get out of your way. You've been more generous than I had any right to expect." Now she did turn, fixing him with a steady gaze that held no judgment, but plenty of determination. "Mr. Patterson, may I ask you something?" "Of course. When you looked at my garden yesterday, what did you see?" The question caught him off guard. He had expected polite dismissal, not continued conversation. "I saw potential. Good bones under the neglect. Your husband knew what he was doing when. He planned it, the spacing, the variety, the way the paths flow. It would just need attention and patience to bring it back." "That's exactly what I thought you'd say." Clara poured coffee into a second mug and handed it to him. "The thing is, I've been looking at that garden for months, knowing it needed help, but having no idea where to start. And then you appeared and saw what I couldn't see. Ma'am, I have a proposition. You said you were looking for work, and I clearly need help maintaining this place. What if we made an arrangement? You could stay in the guest room and help me with the property maintenance. I'd pay you fairly, of course." Jack stared at her, coffee growing cold in his hands. "You don't know anything about me. I know you've been homeless for 8 years, but you still maintain your tools like a craftsman. I know you loved your wife, enough that losing her broke your world apart. I know you speak respectfully to strangers, and you notice when things need fixing." She moved to the kitchen island, began pulling ingredients for breakfast from the refrigerator. "I also know that I've been rattling around this house alone for 18 months, and last night was the first time it felt like a home instead of a museum. Mrs. Whitmore, Clara, and before you start protesting about charity or being a burden, let me tell you something. This house has 14 bedrooms. The property is 5 acres. I'm 63 years old, and I'm tired of pretending I can maintain it all myself." Jack set down his coffee cup, walked to the window, and studied the garden that had brought him to her door. In daylight, he could see more clearly what needed to be done. The rosebush required careful pruning to restore their shape. The hedge needed trimming at specific angles to maintain its classical lines. The stone pathways had settled unevenly and would need to be lifted and re-dash leveled. It was months of work for someone who understood the craft. Years, maybe, if it was to be done properly. "I don't want your pity," he said quietly. "Good, because I don't have any to offer. I need help, and you need work. That's not pity, that's practicality." Jack turned from the window to find Clara watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not sympathy, exactly, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe, of the weight they both carried. "My neighbors are going to talk. My neighbors have been talking for 60 years. I stopped caring what they think around the time I realized they never offered to help with anything. Your children, my children, live their own lives in other cities. They call twice a month and send cards on holidays." Clara's voice held no bitterness, just matter-of-fact acceptance. They're good people, but they're busy people. And they're not here. Jack found himself studying Robert's reading glasses, which Clara had left on the kitchen counter that morning. They were expensive frames, progressive lenses, the kind of glasses that spoke of a man who read widely and cared about seeing clearly. What would your husband think about this arrangement? Clara was quiet for a long moment, her hand still in the midst of cracking eggs into a bowl. Robert always said that a house was just walls and a roof until you filled it with purpose. He believed that helping people wasn't something you did when it was convenient. It was something you did when it was necessary. She began whisking the eggs with more force than required. He would have invited you in for dinner before I worked up the courage to open the gates. The eggs sizzled as they hit the heated pan, filling the kitchen with the domestic sounds that Jack had forgotten he missed. Clara moved with the efficiency of someone who had prepared thousands of meals, adding herbs and cheese with the casual expertise that comes from decades of practice. There's one condition, she said as she divided the scrambled eggs between two plates. What's that? You don't sneak out in the middle of the night because you think you're doing me a favor. If this doesn't work out, we discuss it like adults and part company respectfully. Jack accepted the plate she offered, noting the weight of the china, the subtle pattern around the edges. Everything in this house spoke of quality and permanence, concepts that had become foreign to his recent experience. How long? He asked. How long what? How long do you think this arrangement would last? Clara sat across from him at the kitchen table, her movements deliberate and graceful. How long does anything last, Mr. Patterson? I thought my marriage would last forever, and I was wrong. You thought you'd always have a home, and circumstances changed that too. She took a bite of eggs, chewed thoughtfully. Maybe we don't worry about how long. Maybe we just worry about making it work for today. Outside, the window, the morning sun climbed higher, burning off the dew that had collected on neglected roses. Jack could already see the day's work mapped out before him, which branches to cut, where to apply fresh mulch, how to coax beauty back from abandonment. For the first time in 8 years, he had somewhere to begin. By the end of his first week. At the mansion, Jack had established a routine that felt almost normal. He woke before dawn, made coffee quietly so as not to disturb Clara, and spent the early morning hours working in the garden while the air was still cool. The physical labor felt good after years of aimless walking, and there was deep satisfaction in seeing immediate results from his efforts. The rosebush responded to proper pruning with an enthusiasm that surprised him. New growth appeared within. Days, reaching toward the sun with the resilience that had made roses symbols of hope for centuries. Jack found himself talking to the plants as he worked, sharing observations about their progress the way he used to discuss job sites with his construction crews. Clara's kitchen recipe cards became the foundation of their evening meals. She had collected hundreds of them over the years, handwritten instructions passed down from her mother, newspaper clippings from magazines, notes scrawled on napkins when friends shared successful dishes. The collection represented 40 years of feeding a family, and Clara seemed to find comfort in cooking for two again. This was Robert's favorite, she said one evening, pulling a card from the box as Jack cleaned soil from under his fingernails at the kitchen sink. Beef stew with red wine. He always said it tasted better the second day. My Sarah made something similar. She called it her rainy day stew because she'd make it when the weather kept me from working outside. Did she cook much? Jack dried his hands on the towel Clara had given him, considering the question. She cooked the way some people paint or write poetry. It was how she showed love. I never came home to a bad meal in 23 years of marriage. 23 years. We had 41. Long marriages are rare these days. They weren't always easy, Clara admitted, beginning to brown chunks of beef in a heavy Dutch oven. There were times we barely spoke to each other, usually when the children were teenagers and everything felt chaotic. But we learned how to fight fairly, and we never went to bed angry. Jack settled at the kitchen table, content to watch Clara cook. There was something soothing about the domestic routine, the careful choreography of a woman who knew her kitchen intimately. It reminded him of evenings with Sarah, when the simple act of preparing dinner together had been one of the small pleasures that made marriage feel like a sanctuary. The phone rang as Clara was adding vegetables to the pot. She glanced at the caller ID and sighed. "My daughter Margaret, from Seattle. Should I stay, please?" Clara answered with the carefully cheerful tone parents use when they know difficult conversations are coming. "Hi, sweetheart. How are things?" Jack tried not to listen, but the kitchen was small, and Margaret's voice carried clearly through the speaker. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation last week. About you selling the house. What about it?" "Well, I was talking to Michael and Sarah, and we're all a little concerned about you rattling around in that big place by yourself. Have you given any more thought to that retirement community I mentioned? The one with the golf course?" Clara's hand tightened on the phone. "I'm managing fine where I am. But Mom, be realistic. The maintenance alone must be overwhelming. And what if something happened? What if you fell or had a medical emergency? Nobody would even know." Jack watched Clara's face change as her daughter spoke. The relaxed contentment of the cooking ritual faded, replaced by the careful composure of someone being managed rather than understood. "I'm not an invalid, Margaret. I know that. But you're not 25 anymore either. We just want what's best for you. And you think you know what that is better than I do." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, Margaret's voice becoming increasingly exasperated as Clara deflected every suggestion with polite resistance. When she finally ended the call, Clara stood with her back to Jack for a long moment, staring out at the garden where his work was slowly transforming weeks of neglect into something approaching beauty. "They mean well," she said without turning around. "I'm sure they do. They think I'm a burden that needs managing." Now she faced him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "They love me, but they love the version of me that fits into their busy lives. The one who makes sensible decisions and doesn't require complicated explanations to their friends." Jack had no response that wouldn't sound presumptuous. He was the last person who should offer advice about family relationships, given his own failures in that area. "Margaret has 2 teenagers and a career that requires 60-hour weeks," Clara continued, moving back to the stove to stir the stew. "Michael is going through a divorce and trying to maintain joint custody of his children. Sarah just got promoted and travels constantly for work. They're good people dealing with their own challenges. But you're lonely." The words came out before Jack could stop them, and he immediately wished he could take them back. It wasn't his place to make observations about Clara's emotional state, but Clara nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "I am lonely. This house used to be full of noise and chaos and life. Now it's full of memories and silence and the sound of my own footsteps echoing off walls that used to absorb conversation and laughter. Is that why you invited me to stay?" "Partly." She turned down the heat under the pot, covered it, and joined him at the table. "But also because you looked at my garden and saw what it could become instead of what it had turned into. That's a rare gift. I just see what needs fixing." "Exactly. And you believe it can be fixed." They ate dinner by candlelight, a habit Clara had maintained from her married years. The flickering flames cast gentle shadows around the kitchen, making the space feel intimate and warm. Jack found himself relaxing in ways he had forgotten were possible, letting his shoulders drop and his breathing slow. After dinner, they settled in the living room with coffee. Clara had a crossword puzzle from the morning paper, and Jack examined a loose hinge on a cabinet door that had been bothering him all week. Jack. Yes. Do you ever have nightmares? About being homeless, I mean. The question caught him off guard. He had been carefully avoiding any discussion of the darker aspects of his recent years, not wanting to burden Clara with the realities of life without shelter or security. Sometimes, he admitted. What about? Jack set down his screwdriver and considered how much truth she could handle, cold mostly, and being invisible. People look through you when you're homeless, like you're not quite human anymore. The nightmares are usually about trying to get someone's attention and being completely ignored. That must have been terrifying. The fear wasn't the worst part. The worst part was starting to believe that maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't worth noticing anymore. Clara looked up from her crossword, pen paused over the grid. But you kept your tools clean. Yes. Why? Because they were proof that I used to be someone who mattered. Someone who could build things, fix things, make things better. Jack picked up the screwdriver again, tested the cabinet hinges' movement. As long as I kept them ready, I could still hope that someday I'd have a chance to use them again. And now you do. Now I do. Clara returned to her puzzle, but Jack could sense her thinking about his answer. The comfortable silence that settled over them felt different from the lonely quiet that had defined both their lives for so long. This was the silence of companionship, of two people content to share space without feeling obligated to fill every moment with conversation. Outside, night sounds replaced the daytime chorus of birds and distant traffic. The house settled around them with the gentle creaks and sighs of old wood and established foundations. Jack found himself listening to the rhythms of the building, learning its voice the way he had learned the sounds of every house he had ever lived in. For the first time in 8 years, the approaching darkness held no anxiety. He had a roof, a bed, and tomorrow's work already planned. It was such a simple thing, this basic security that most people took for granted, but Jack felt its value in every bone of his body. When Clara finished her crossword and they both prepared for bed, she paused at the bottom of the staircase. Jack? Yes? Thank you for staying. Thank you for asking me to. I didn't realize how much I needed the company until I had it. Jack nodded, understanding more than she knew. Good night, Clara. Good night. As he climbed the stairs to his room, Jack reflected on how quickly the extraordinary could begin to feel normal. A week ago, the idea of sleeping in a mansion would have seemed like fantasy. Now it was simply home, at least temporarily. He placed Sarah's photograph on the nightstand as he had every night since arriving. But tonight he found himself talking to her picture about the day's small successes instead of his fears about the future. She's a good woman, he whispered to the image. You would have liked her cooking, and she would have loved your garden ideas. I think you would have been friends. The photograph smiled back at him with the eternal warmth that had sustained him through 9 years of grief and 8 years of homelessness. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Jack found himself able to imagine a future that included more than mere survival. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Jack presented Clara with a hand-carved wooden bird. He had found a piece of cherry wood in Robert's workshop in the basement, a small board that had been set aside for some project that never came to fruition. Working in the evenings after his garden duties were complete, Jack had shaped the wood with tools he hadn't used in years, letting muscle memory guide his hands as the bird emerged from the raw material. It was a simple piece, a sparrow in flight, wings spread wide, captured in a moment of freedom. The grain of the wood followed the curve of the wings naturally, and Jack had left most of the surface unfinished to show the beauty of the cherries. Natural color. It's beautiful, Clara said, turning the carving over in her hands. I haven't seen craftsmanship like this since Robert used to make things in his workshop. Jack felt heat rise in his cheeks. It's nothing fancy. Just something to keep my hands busy in the evenings. Don't diminish it. This represents hours of careful work. Clara placed the bird on the kitchen windowsill, where the morning light would catch its polished surface. "Tell me about your wife. You mention her sometimes, but I'd like to know more about who she was." The request came gently, without the probing curiosity that had made Jack uncomfortable in the past when people asked about his history. Clara's question felt like an invitation rather than an intrusion. Sarah was. Jack paused, searching for words that could encompass 23 years of marriage. She was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel more interesting than they actually were. She had this way of listening that made you want to tell her things you'd never told anyone else. "How did you meet?" "At a construction site. Actually, I was building an addition to her parents' house, and she came by every day after work to check on the progress. She was a nurse at the local hospital, and she'd still be in her scrubs most times." Jack smiled at the memory. "She'd bring me iced tea and ask questions about the work. Not just polite questions. She really wanted to understand how things went together, why we did things in a certain order. She sounds lovely. She was. And patient God, she was patient. When I started my own business, there were lean years when we barely scraped by. Sarah never complained, never suggested I should go work for someone else where the paycheck would be steady. She believed in what I was trying to build, even when I didn't believe in it myself." Clara refilled their coffee cups, moving with the Bundy quiet efficiency that Jack had come to associate with her careful way of navigating the world. What kind of cancer? The question he had been expecting, the one that always came when people learned about Sarah's death. Breast cancer. She found the lump herself during a routine self-exam. By the time they caught it, it had already spread to her lymph nodes. "How long?" 18 months from diagnosis to, Jack's voice caught. Even after 9 years saying, the words aloud remained difficult. 18 months of surgeries and chemotherapy and radiation treatments. 18 months of watching the strongest person I'd ever known get smaller and weaker every day. Were you able to care for her at home? Toward the end, yes. She wanted to die in our bedroom, looking out at the garden she'd spent 15 years creating. I took a leave of absence from work to be with her full-time those last 3 months. Clara reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The gesture was simple, maternal, but it carried the weight of someone who understood grief intimately. That's when the business started falling apart, Jack continued, finding it easier to talk with Clara's hand anchoring him to the present moment. I had employees who depended on me, contracts that needed to be fulfilled, but I couldn't focus on anything except making sure Sarah was comfortable. I made mistakes, big ones. Missed deadlines, ordered wrong materials, showed up to job sites. Unprepared. Anyone would have struggled in that situation. Maybe, but I was the one responsible for keeping everything together, and I failed. By the time Sarah died, I'd lost 3 major clients, and my reputation was shot. The remaining work dried up within 6 months. What about the house? Mortgage to pay for medical expenses that insurance wouldn't cover. Experimental treatments, alternative therapies, anything that might have given us more time. Jack traced the pattern in the tablecloth with his free hand, remembering the desperate hope that had driven every financial decision during Sarah's illness. After she died, I couldn't make the payments. Foreclosed 14 months later. Where did you go? At first, I stayed with friends. Different couches, spare bedrooms, people being kind, but not really equipped for a long-term house guest. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that I'd get back on my feet once I worked through the grief. But you didn't. No, the grief just got heavier and angrier. I'd wake up every morning furious that Sarah was gone while I was still here, still breathing, still taking up space in a world that felt pointless without her. Jack looked up to meet Clara's eyes. Have you felt that? The anger that comes with being left behind. Clara's nod was immediate and certain. The first year after Robert died, I was so angry I could barely function. Angry at him for leaving. Angry at God for taking him. Angry at myself for all the conversations we'd never have and all the plans we'd never fulfill. Yes, exactly that. But also angry at other people for continuing with their normal lives while my world had ended. I used to watch couples in restaurants or walking together in the park, and I'd want to scream at them. I'd want to shake them and tell them to pay attention, to appreciate what they had because it could disappear in a heartbeat. Did you consider, Clara hesitated, then pressed on with the courage of someone who had faced dark thoughts herself. Did you ever think about joining her? Jack was quiet for a long moment, surprised by the relief he felt at having someone ask the question directly instead of dancing around it. Every day for about 2 years. I'd go to bed hoping I wouldn't wake up, and I'd wake up disappointed that I had. The only thing that stopped me was knowing Sarah would have been furious if I gave up. She fought so hard to stay alive, even when the treatments were worse than the disease. Giving up would have made her sacrifice meaningless. So you kept going. I kept breathing. I wouldn't call it living. I lost job after job because I couldn't focus. Couldn't bring myself to care about deadlines or quality or customer service. I'd show up when I felt like it, do half-hearted work, and wonder why people stopped hiring me. Clara squeezed his hand. How long before you ended up on the streets? 3 years. 3 years of burning through the patience of everyone who tried to help me. 3 years of telling myself I just needed more time to get my life together. Jack looked out the window at the garden where his recent work was beginning to show real progress. The first night I slept in my truck, I told myself it would just be for a week or two. That was 8 years ago. What changed? I mean, what? Kept you going for 8 years without joining Sarah? Honestly, stubbornness. And the realization that being homeless doesn't kill you as quickly as you might hope. Your body adapts, finds ways to survive, even when your spirit has given up. Eventually, survival becomes habit instead of choice. Clara released his hand and stood to clear their coffee cups, but Jack could see her processing his story, comparing it to her own experience of loss. Robert's death was different, she said, as she rinsed the cups in the sink. He had a heart attack while working in the garden. One moment he was pruning roses, and the next moment he was gone. No warning, no chance to say goodbye, no time to prepare. In some ways, that might have been easier. I used to think so. I used to envy people whose spouses had long illnesses because at least they got to have final conversations, to say all the things that needed saying. But now I think every kind of loss has its own special cruelty. Do you miss him more at certain times of day? Evenings, mostly. That was our time together, after dinner, when we'd sit in the living room and talk about our days. Robert was a good listener, and he had opinions about everything. I still find myself composing conversations with him in my head, planning to tell him about something that happened, and then remembering he's not there to listen. Jack understood completely. He still caught himself saving up stories to tell Sarah, still mentally noted things she would have found funny or interesting, still reached for the phone sometimes to call her before remembering that her number no longer connected to anything but memory. The hardest part, Clara continued, is realizing that I spent 41 years being half of something, and now I have to figure out how to be a whole person on my own. I don't even know who I am without him. You're someone who invites homeless strangers in for coffee. That's new behavior. The old Clara would never have taken such a risk. Maybe the old Clara didn't need to take risks. Maybe she had everything she needed. Clara dried her hands on a dish towel, considering this. What about you? Are you different than you were before? Completely. The old Jack was confident, maybe even a little arrogant about his skills and his ability to handle whatever life threw at him. He thought hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. Jack looked at his hands, noting the calluses that had never fully disappeared despite years of irregular work. The new Jack knows how quickly everything you've built can disappear. He knows that pride and self-reliance are luxuries you can only afford when the world is cooperating with your plans. Is that wisdom or just defeat? I'm still figuring that out. They spent the rest of the evening in comfortable conversation, sharing memories and observations with the ease of people who had found an unexpected kinship. Clara told him about the early years of her marriage, when she and Robert were figuring out how to blend their different backgrounds and expectations into something that worked for both of them. Jack told her about the satisfaction he had found in his craft, the pride that came from seeing a project through from concept to completion. As they prepared for bed, Clara paused at the foot of the staircase, as had become her habit. "Jack? Yes? I'm glad you kept going. After Sarah died, I mean. I'm glad you didn't give up, even when it would have been easier. Most days I am too. This is one of them. Good, because tomorrow I'll show you something Robert was working on before he died. I think you might be the person to finish it." As Jack climbed the stairs to his room, he reflected on how much had changed in just 3 weeks. The desperate man who had appeared at Clara's gates had been focused entirely on survival, on making it through each day without thinking too far beyond the next meal or safe place to sleep. But tonight, as he prepared for bed in a room that was beginning to feel familiar, Jack found himself thinking about tomorrow's possibilities instead of yesterday's losses. Clara's trust had given him something he'd thought was gone forever, a sense of purpose that extended beyond mere survival. He placed Sarah's photograph on the nightstand and studied her face in the lamplight, looking for approval or concern, or guidance. But for the first time since her death, the picture seemed to be smiling at him rather than mourning with him. "I think I'm starting to heal," he whispered to her image. "Not forgetting you, never that, but maybe learning to live with missing you instead of dying from it." The house settled around him with sounds that were becoming familiar, and Jack fell asleep to the comforting knowledge that tomorrow he would wake up with work to do and someone who was counting on him to do it well. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail in an envelope bearing the return address of a prestigious Seattle law firm. Clara signed for it with hands that trembled slightly, though she couldn't have explained why the official correspondence filled her with such immediate dread. Inside was a formal document, typed on heavyweight letterhead with language that managed to sound both loving and threatening. "Dear Mother, we are writing as your children who love you and are deeply concerned about your welfare and decision-making capacity. Recent reports from neighbors have indicated that you are housing an unknown individual in your home, a person with no verifiable background or references. While we understand that loneliness may have influenced this decision, we feel compelled to address the potential dangers and legal implications of this arrangement. We have consulted with legal counsel regarding our options for ensuring your safety and protecting your interests. Please understand that we are prepared to take whatever steps are necessary, including petitioning for guardianship. If your judgment appears to be compromised by grief or other factors, we will be arriving this Friday to discuss this situation in person. Until then, we strongly urge you to reconsider the wisdom of maintaining this living arrangement with a stranger. With love and concern, Margaret, Michael, and Sarah. Clara read the letter 3 times, each reading making her angrier. Then the last. She found Jack in the garden, where he was carefully training climbing roses along a trellis that he had repaired the previous week. He looked up as she approached, and his face immediately registered concern at her expression. "What's wrong?" Clara handed him the letter without a word. She watched his face change as he read, saw the familiar resignation that crossed his features when he reached the part about his unverifiable background. "I'll pack my things," he said quietly, folding the letter and handing it back to her. "You will not. Clara, this is your family we're talking about. I'm not worth causing permanent damage to those relationships. My family is threatening to have me declared incompetent because I chose to help someone in need. They're treating me like a child who can't be trusted to make her own decisions. Clara's voice rose with each word, years of suppressed frustration, finally finding an outlet. I am 63 years old. I am not senile, I am not broke, and I am not a danger to myself or others. But they love you, and they're scared. They love the version of me that makes convenient decisions and doesn't require them to worry or think too hard about my welfare. They love the mother who stays in her proper place and doesn't do anything. That might reflect poorly on their own choices. Jack set down his pruning shears and studied Clara's face with the careful attention he usually reserved for assessing damaged woodwork. What do you want to do? I want to tell them that I'm a grown woman who can choose her own house guests. I want to remind them that I raised 3 children, managed a household, and supported their father's career for 40 years without requiring supervision or legal intervention. That's not what I meant. Clara felt some of her anger deflate as she recognized the deeper question he was asking. Not what she wanted to say to her children, but what she was willing to sacrifice to keep him here. I want you to stay, she said simply. Not just because you're helping with the house, but because you're my friend. Because having you here makes me feel like myself again, instead of just Robert's widow. You children won't understand that. Then I'll help them understand. Jack picked up his tools and began cleaning them with the methodical care that Clara had come to recognize as his way of thinking through complicated problems. What if they're right, though? What if I'm taking advantage of your kindness? What if letting me stay here is just loneliness making you do something foolish? Are you taking advantage of me? Not intentionally. Are you planning to steal from me or hurt me or abuse my trust in some way? Of course not. Then my children are wrong, and their lawyers can go find someone else to intimidate. But even as Clara spoke with defiant confidence, she could feel doubt creeping in around the edges of her certainty. Was she being foolish? Was her judgment compromised by grief and loneliness? Margaret's words about decision-making capacity echoed in her mind with uncomfortable persistence. The doubt must have shown on her face, because Jack's expression gentled. Clara, maybe they have a point. You don't really know me. You don't know what I was like before I became homeless, or what I might be capable of under pressure. I know what I've seen. I know you're kind and respectful and hardworking. I know. You've brought life back to this garden and purpose back to my days. You know what I've chosen to show you. People can hide a lot when they need to. Clara felt a flash of irritation at his willingness to validate her children's concerns. You hiding something from me? No. But I'm asking you to consider whether your children might have legitimate reasons for concern, even if their methods are heavy-handed. They don't know you. Neither do you, really. 3 weeks isn't very long. Clara stared at him, trying to reconcile this careful stranger with the man who had carved her a wooden bird, who listened to her stories about Robert with genuine interest, who had transformed her overgrown garden into something approaching its former beauty. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe I should leave before your family arrives. Not because I think they're right, but because preserving your relationship with your children is more important than preserving our arrangement. And what happens to you? Jack shrugged with the practiced resignation of someone who had learned not to count on stability. I go back to what I was doing before. I manage. Living on the streets, sleeping in shelters, being invisible. It's not the life I'd choose, but it's the life I know how to navigate. Clara felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest, an emotion she hadn't experienced since her children were young, and she would have fought anyone who tried to harm them. No, she said firmly. I won't let them bully me into abandoning someone who needs help just because it makes them uncomfortable. Clara, my husband used to say that the measure of a person's character isn't how they treat people who can do something for them, but how they treat people who can't. You can't do anything for me, Jack. You can't enhance my social standing or improve my children's opinion of me or make my life easier in any measurable way. But you've made it better. You've made it feel worth living again. Jack was quiet for a long moment, his attention apparently focused on a rose bloom that was just beginning to open. When he spoke, his voice was careful and measured. What if we compromise? What if I stay until after your children visit, so you can have the conversation you want to have, but I find somewhere else to go afterward? That way you get to make your point about being capable of your own decisions, but you also show them that you're willing to consider their concerns. That's not a compromise. That's capitulation. It's diplomacy. Clara wanted to argue, but she could see the wisdom in his suggestion, even as she hated it. Her children's letter had escalated the situation beyond simple disagreement into the realm of legal threats and public intervention. If she wanted to maintain any relationship with Margaret, Michael, and Sarah, she would need to find a way to address their fears while also asserting her autonomy. But the thought of losing Jack's companionship, of returning to the lonely routine that had defined her days before he arrived, made her chest tight with panic. How long until you'd have to leave? I don't know. That would depend on what your children say when they get here, and how willing they are to accept that you're capable of making this choice. And if they're not willing, then I pack my tools and move on, and you get to decide whether maintaining peace with your family is worth more than standing up for what you believe is right. Clara looked around the garden that Jack had brought back to life at the careful work that represented hours of patient attention to detail. Tomorrow he would deadhead the roses and trim the hedge that bordered the driveway. Next week he planned to repair the stone wall that separated the flower beds from the lawn. All of it would stop if he left, and the garden would gradually return to the neglected state that had made her feel so overwhelmed just a month ago. But more than that, the house would return to its museum-like silence, and Clara would return to the careful routine of managing loneliness that had defined her days since Robert's death. What will you tell them when they get here? The truth. That you needed help with the property, that I needed work and a place to stay, and that we've both benefited from the arrangement. That you're not being taken advantage of, and that your judgment is sound. Will they believe you? Jack smiled, but there was sadness in it. Probably not. People see what they expect to see, and they expect to see a homeless man taking advantage of a lonely widow. The fact that it's not true doesn't change the story they've already written in their heads. That evening, Clara called each of her children to tell them she had received their letter and looked forward to their visit. The conversations were strained, filled with careful politeness that barely concealed the battle lines being drawn. Margaret was the most direct. Mom, we're not trying to control your life. We're trying to protect you from someone who might not have your best interests at heart. Michael was gentler but no less determined. I just want to meet this guy and make sure he's legitimate. If he's really as wonderful as you say, then he won't mind answering a few questions. Sarah took the approach of wounded concern. Mom, I can't sleep at night knowing there's a stranger in your house. Please, just consider our feelings in this. Clara listened to each of them with growing frustration. They spoke about Jack as if he were a predator rather than a person, as if her judgment were inherently suspect rather than simply different from their preferences. When she finally went to bed that night, Clara stood at her bedroom window, looking down at the guest room where Jack was staying. She could see the faint glow of his reading lamp through the curtains, and she wondered if he was planning his departure or simply trying to read himself to sleep. For the first time since Robert's death, Clara felt the weight of a decision that would define not just her immediate future, but the kind of person she wanted to be in whatever years remained to her. She could choose safety and peace with her children, or she could choose risk and the possibility of genuine friendship with someone who understood loneliness from the inside. Either way, Friday would bring a reckoning that would change everything. Clara had been avoiding Robert's private study for 18 months, but her children's legal threat had forced her hand. If she was going to defend her decision-making capacity, she needed to organize her financial documents and ensure that everything was in order for their inevitable scrutiny. The last place she wanted to be was sitting at Robert's desk, but it was where he had kept their important papers. The room still smelled faintly of his cologne and the pipe tobacco he had enjoyed in the evenings. His reading glasses lay exactly where he had left them on the morning of his heart attack, folded beside a half-finished crossword puzzle that Clara couldn't bring herself to complete or throw away. She worked methodically through file folders, labeled in Robert's careful handwriting: insurance, investments, tax documents, estate planning. Everything was organized with the precision of a man who understood that death might come without warning and wanted to make things as easy as possible for those left behind. It was in the estate planning folder that Clara found the envelope with her name written across it in Robert's distinctive script. Inside was a letter dated just 3 months before his death, along with legal documents that made her hands shake as she read them. My darling Clara, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're trying to make sense of the practical matters I've left behind. I'm sorry to burden you with one more decision, but this one is too important to leave to chance or assumption. I've been thinking a lot lately about legacy, not just the money we'll leave behind, but the meaning we've made of our time together. We've been blessed with more than we ever needed, and I believe that blessing comes with responsibility. I've drawn up papers to donate the house to the Riverside Homeless Coalition after your death, but I realize now that this decision affects you as much as it affects any future beneficiaries. So I'm leaving the choice in your hands. The attached documents give you the option to complete this donation during your lifetime if you choose. The coalition would use the property as a transitional housing facility, helping people get back on their feet after experiencing homelessness. It would be a living memorial to our belief that everyone deserves a chance at dignity and stability. I know this might seem sudden, but it's not. Do you remember the promise we made on our 10th wedding anniversary? We were walking through downtown after dinner, and we passed that man sleeping in the doorway of the bookstore. You stopped and gave him $20, and when I asked why, you said, because we promised each other we'd never let good souls go without shelter if we had the power to help. I've never forgotten that moment or that promise. This house has given us 40 years of shelter and happiness. Maybe it's time to share that gift. I'm not telling you what to do, my love. I'm simply giving you the option to fulfill a dream we once shared, if you still believe in it. All my love, always, Robert P.S. If you choose to make the donation during your lifetime, the coalition has agreed to provide you with a comfortable apartment in their new senior housing complex, along with a generous monthly stipend. You wouldn't be giving up security, just sighs. Clara read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing layers of meaning she had missed before. Robert hadn't just been planning to give away their house after she died. He had been hoping she might choose to give it away while she was still alive to see the good it could do. The legal documents were complex but clear. Robert had established a charitable trust with their house as the primary asset. Clara could choose to complete the donation at any time, or she could let the house pass to the trust after her death as originally planned. She sat back in Robert's chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was asking and by the timing of her discovery. Here she was, preparing to defend her right to house one homeless man, while her late husband had been planning to house dozens. A knock at the study door interrupted her thoughts. Jack stood in the doorway, looking uncertain about whether he was welcome in Robert's private space. I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to let you know I'm finished with the rose beds for the day. Clara looked at him, this weathered man who had been homeless for 8 years, who had appeared at her gates at the exact moment when she was contemplating selling the house. who had brought purpose back to her days and life back to her garden, and felt a chill of recognition run down her spine. "Jack, come here. I need to show you something." He approached cautiously, noting the papers scattered across the desk and the expression on Clara's face. "What is it?" Clara handed him Robert's letter without explanation. She watched his face as he read, saw his eyes widen as he processed the implications of what Robert had been planning. "He wanted to donate your house to help homeless people," Jack said quietly. "Not just wanted to. He set up all the legal structures to make it possible. All I have to do is sign these papers, and the house becomes a transitional housing facility." Jack set the letter down carefully, as if it were something precious that might break. That's an incredible gift he was planning to make. We were planning to make. He mentions a promise we made years ago, and I remember it clearly now. We were young and idealistic, and convinced we could change the world with good intentions and generous hearts. And now? Clara looked around the study that had been Robert's sanctuary, at the books he would never read and the projects he would never complete. "Now I'm wondering if this is why you appeared at my gates when you did. Not coincidence, but providence. Clara, think about it. I was preparing to sell this house to strangers who would turn it into just another expensive property for wealthy people. Instead, I met someone who's been homeless for 8 years. Someone who understands exactly what Robert was trying to address with this donation." Jack shook his head slowly. "You can't make a decision this important based on coincidence and wishful thinking, can I? What if it's not wishful thinking? What if Robert somehow arranged for you to find me at exactly the moment when I needed to understand what he was trying to tell me? Robert is dead, Clara. He didn't arrange anything. Maybe not directly. But maybe the universe has a way of putting people where they need to be, when they need to be there." Clara stood and moved too. The window that looked out over the garden Jack had restored. In the fading afternoon light, she could see the results of his careful work: roses blooming with renewed vigor, hedges trimmed to classical proportions, pathways cleared of weeds and debris. "You've brought this place back to life in just a few weeks. Imagine what you could do if you had years instead of weeks. Imagine what this place could become if it was dedicated to helping people like you get back on their feet. You're talking about giving away a house worth millions of dollars. I'm talking about finally keeping a promise I made 40 years ago." Jack joined her at the window, and together they looked out at the grounds that represented decades of careful planning and patient cultivation. "What about your children? They're already concerned about your judgment. If you tell them you're planning to give away their inheritance to help homeless people, then they'll really think I've lost my mind." Clara turned from the window to face Jack directly. "But maybe that's exactly what I need to do. Maybe I need to lose the mind that thinks keeping this house makes sense when there are people sleeping in doorways every night. Clara, you're not thinking clearly. You're upset about your children's letter, and you're making emotional decisions based on coincidence and grief. Or maybe I'm thinking clearly for the first time since Robert died. Maybe I've been so focused on maintaining the life we built together that I forgot about the dreams we shared." Clara picked up the legal documents and studied the signature lines that would transform her comfortable existence into something entirely different and possibly more meaningful. "There's something else," she said quietly. "The trust Robert established doesn't just provide housing for homeless individuals. It also includes provisions for hiring formerly homeless people to help run the facility, property maintenance, groundskeeping, basic administration." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if I complete this donation, there would be a job waiting for someone with your skills and experience. Someone who understands the population being served because he's been part of it." Jack stared at her, his expression cycling through disbelief, hope, and something that might have been terror. "You're offering me a job running the place that used to be your home? I'm offering you a chance to help other people the way you've helped me. to use your skills for something more than survival. And what happens to you? Clara gestured to the papers on Robert's desk. I get an apartment in the senior housing complex the coalition is building. I get a monthly stipend that's more than adequate for my needs. And I get to see this house used for something Robert and I always believed in, instead of sitting empty most of the time while I rattle around in it alone. This is insane. This is exactly what Robert hoped I would do. He knew me well enough to know that I'd need to see the need firsthand before I'd be brave enough to meet it. Jack was quiet for a long moment, studying the legal documents with the careful attention of someone who understood that words on paper could change lives in ways both wonderful and terrible. Your children will never forgive you. My children will have to decide whether they love me enough to support a decision that might actually make the world a little better, or whether they only love the version of me that makes choices they approve of. And if they choose to challenge this legally, Clara smiled for the first time since reading Robert's letter. Then they'll discover that their mother is neither senile nor incompetent, and that giving away your own property to help people in need is not evidence of diminished capacity. It's evidence of moral clarity. She picked up Robert's pen from the desk and tested it against a piece of scrap paper. The ink flowed smoothly, as if it had been waiting 18 months for this moment. Jack, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. What? If I sign these papers tonight, will you stay and help me turn this place into something that would make Robert proud? Jack looked around the study where Robert had planned this extraordinary gift, then back at Clara, who was holding the pen. That would make it reality. Are you sure this is what you want? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Then yes, I'll stay, and I'll help, and I'll try to honor what both of you are trying to build here. Clara signed her name with the same careful precision Robert had used for 40 years of important documents. As her signature dried on the paper, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before his death, a sense of purpose that extended beyond her own comfort and security. When do we tell you children? Tomorrow, when they arrive expecting to find a foolish old woman who needs their protection. Instead, they'll find someone who's finally figured out how to keep the promises she made when she was young enough to believe anything was possible. Friday morning arrived with the weight of impending confrontation. Clara woke before dawn, dressed carefully in the navy suit she had worn to Robert's funeral, and spent an hour selecting items from her mother's jewelry box pieces she would take with her when she moved to the senior housing complex, mementos that represented what truly mattered versus what merely took up space. The jewelry box itself was a work of art, hand-carved by her father when Clara was 16. Each compartment held memories along with gems. Her engagement ring from Robert, still stunning after 42 years. Her grandmother's pearl earrings worn on every important occasion. A simple gold bracelet that had been her mother's last gift before cancer claimed her. These were the treasures worth preserving, Clara realized as she sorted through decades of accumulated jewelry. Not the expensive pieces Robert had given her for anniversaries and birthdays, but the items that carried stories and connected her to people she had loved. Jack appeared in the kitchen as she was making coffee with extra care, knowing that her children would judge everything from the cleanliness of the counters to the quality of the breakfast she served. "How are you feeling?" he asked, noting her formal attire and the careful way she moved around the kitchen. Terrified and determined in equal measure. That seems about right. Clara had called the lawyer representing the Riverside Homeless Coalition the previous evening, setting in motion the legal processes that would transfer ownership of the mansion by the end of the month. The paperwork was complex, but not impossible. Robert had planned well, and his attorney had prepared documents that anticipated every potential complication. But she hadn't told her children what she intended to do. That conversation would happen, face to face, where they could see her competence and resolve rather than simply hearing what they would interpret as the ravings of a grief-stricken woman. "Margaret's flight lands at 10, Clara said, checking the kitchen clock. "Michael and Sarah are driving down from Portland. They should be here by noon. I thought we could have lunch together, and then I'll tell them about Robert's letter and my decision. Do you want me to be here for that conversation?" Clara considered this carefully. Having Jack present might validate her children's concerns about his influence over her judgment, but his absence might suggest she was hiding something or ashamed of her decision. "Yes, I want you here. This affects you too, and they need to. Understand that you're not some predator taking advantage of my loneliness. You're a partner in something Robert and I always believed was important." Jack nodded, though Clara could see the anxiety in his posture. He had spent the morning cleaning tools and organizing his belongings, the behavior of someone preparing for another departure, another disruption to whatever stability he had managed to build. "Jack, you don't have to leave no matter how they react. The house is mine to do with as I please, and their approval isn't required for the donation to proceed. Legally, maybe not, but family relationships are more complicated than legal documents. Yes, they are, but I won't be held hostage by the threat that my children will withdraw their love if I make choices they don't approve of." Margaret arrived first, in a rental car that looked like it had been selected for maximum respectability. She hugged Clara with careful affection, the kind of embrace that conveyed dutiful love rather than spontaneous warmth. "You look well, Mom. I was worried you might be losing weight or showing signs of stress. I'm fine, dear. Actually, I'm better than I've been since your father died." Margaret's eyes swept the kitchen, taking inventory of everything from the cleanliness of the appliances to the fresh flowers Jack had cut from the garden that morning. "Where is he?" "The man you've been housing? His name is Jack, and he's working in the garden. You'll meet him when your brother and sister arrive. Mom, before the others get here, I need to ask you some difficult questions." Clara poured coffee into her best china cups and settled across from Margaret at the kitchen table. Her eldest daughter had inherited Robert's directness, along with his sharp intelligence, and Clara had always respected her willingness to address problems head-on. "Ask whatever you need to ask. Has this man asked you for money?" "No." "Has he suggested that you change your will or make any financial arrangements that would benefit him?" "No." "Has he made any romantic advances or suggestions about a more intimate relationship?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from anger at the implications of Margaret's questions. "Margaret, Jack is a decent man who needed work and shelter. I needed help maintaining this property and someone to talk to in the evenings. We've developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared experiences with grief. Nothing more. Nothing less. But you don't really know anything about his background. He could have a criminal history, or problems with drugs or alcohol. He could. But I've seen no evidence of any of those things, and I've learned to trust my judgment about people's character." Margaret leaned forward, her expression earnest and concerned. "Mom, that's exactly what worries us. Your judgment about people has always been based on Dad being there as a second opinion, as someone who could see things you might miss. Without him, I've had to learn to make my own assessments. And I've discovered that I'm better at reading people than I gave myself credit for." Michael and Sarah arrived together, having met at the Portland airport and driven down in Michael's SUV. The family reunion was warm but strained, with everyone careful to avoid the subject that had brought them together until after lunch had been served and cleared away. Clara had prepared Robert's favorite meal roast chicken with herbs from the garden, mashed potatoes, green beans that Jack had picked that morning. The conversation during lunch was determinedly normal, focusing on the grandchildren's activities and everyone's work responsibilities. But when Clara stood to clear the dessert plates, Margaret spoke the words that shifted them into confrontation. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation." "Yes, we do. But first, I want you to meet Jack." She called him in from the garden, where he had been carefully staying out of sight while still remaining close enough to provide support if needed. He entered the dining room with his hat in his hands, his work clothes clean but clearly showing the evidence of physical labor. "Jack Patterson," Clara said formally, "I'd like you to meet my children. Margaret, Michael, and Sarah." The handshakes were polite but cool, with Clara's children assessing Jack with the careful attention of people looking for reasons to disapprove. Jack bore their scrutiny with quiet dignity, answering their questions about his work on the property, with specifics that demonstrated both competence and respect for what he had been hired to do. "Mr. Patterson," Margaret said, after the introductions were complete, "we appreciate the work you've done here, but we're concerned about the arrangement you have with our mother. What specifically concerns you? The fact that she knows nothing about your background or qualifications. The fact that you're living in her house without any formal agreement or references from previous employers." Jack nodded calmly. "Those are reasonable concerns. If I were in your position, I'd have questions too. So you understand why we think this arrangement should end. I understand why you're worried. But I also understand that your mother is capable of making her own decisions about who she trusts and why." Sarah spoke for the first time since Jack had entered the room. "Mr. Patterson, you seem like a nice man, but surely you can see that this situation puts our mother in a vulnerable position. Your mother has never been vulnerable in my presence. She's been kind and generous and strong enough to take a chance on someone when she had no obligation to do so." "But what are your intentions here?" Michael asked. "What do you want from this arrangement?" The question hung in the air with uncomfortable weight. Clara could see Jack considering how much truth would help versus hurt their cause. "I want to continue helping your mother maintain this property, and I want to earn enough money to eventually get back on my feet and find permanent housing. So this is temporary for you?" Jack glanced at Clara, seeking permission to share what they had discussed the previous evening. She nodded slightly. "Actually, the situation has changed. Yesterday, your mother discovered some documents that your father left, documents that affect the future of this house in ways none of us expected." Margaret's expression sharpened immediately. "What kind of documents?" Clara stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that were steadier than she had expected. "Your father left me a letter explaining his hopes for this property after his death. He also left me the legal means to fulfill those hopes during my lifetime, if I chose to." "What are you talking about?" Clara excused herself and returned with Robert's letter and the legal documents she had signed the previous evening. She handed them to Margaret, who read quickly while her siblings looked over her shoulder. The silence that followed was deafening. "You've got to be kidding me," Michael said finally. "Dad wanted to give away our family home to help homeless people? Your father wanted to honor a promise we made to each other 40 years ago. A promise to help people in need when we had the resources to do so." "But this is our inheritance," Sarah protested. "This house has been in the family for decades. You can't just give it away to strangers." "I can, and I have. The papers are already filed." Margaret looked up from the documents with an expression Clara had never seen before, a mixture of disbelief, betrayal, and something that might have been fear. "Mom, please tell me you haven't actually signed these papers." "I signed them last night." "Then we need to stop this immediately. We need to call Dad's lawyer and find out how to reverse this decision." "There's nothing to reverse. Your father's wishes were clear, and my decision is final. Your decision is insane." Michael's voice rose for the first time since childhood. "You're giving away millions of dollars because some homeless man convinced you it was what Dad wanted." "Jack didn't convince me of anything. Your father's own words convinced me, written in a letter that conveniently appeared just after this stranger moved into your house." Clara felt something cold settle in her chest at the implication in Michael's words. "Are you suggesting that Jack forged your father's letter?" I'm suggesting that it's awfully convenient timing." Jack spoke quietly from his position near the doorway. "The letter was written in your father's handwriting, on his personal stationery, and signed with his fountain pen. It was sealed in an envelope that had never been opened before yesterday. I had nothing to do with its creation or its contents." "So you say," Margaret replied coldly. "So I know. And so does your mother, which is why she made the decision she made. The decision she made while under your influence." Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough. All of you." Her voice carried an authority that made everyone in the room pause. "Jack, would you please excuse us? I need to speak with my children privately." After he left, Clara remained standing while her 3 children sat around the dining room table like judges preparing to render a verdict. "Let me be very clear about something," she said, her voice steady and cold. "I am 63 years old. I have been managing my own affairs since before any of you were born. I am not senile, I am not incompetent, and I am not being manipulated by anyone." "Mom," Sarah began. "I'm not finished. Your father spent months planning this donation because he believed it was the right thing to do. He left me the choice of when and how to implement it because he trusted my judgment. If you can't extend me the same courtesy he did, then perhaps we need to reconsider the nature of our relationship. Are you threatening to cut us out of your life if we don't support this insane decision?" Margaret asked. "I'm telling you that. I won't be bullied or manipulated into abandoning a course of action that I believe is morally correct and personally fulfilling. What about our inheritance? What about the grandchildren's college funds? What about the security you'll need as you get older? The trust provides me with an apartment and a generous monthly stipend. I'll have everything I need for my remaining years. As for your inheritance, perhaps it's time you learn to build your own wealth instead of depending on what your parents leave behind." The words were harsher than Clara had intended, but she didn't regret them. Her children had grown up with the assumption that the mansion would eventually be theirs, without considering whether they had done anything to earn such a windfall, or whether there might be better uses for such resources. "We're not going to let you do this," Margaret said, her voice taking on the tone she used in hostile business negotiations. "We'll petition for guardianship, and we'll contest the donation on the grounds that you're not mentally competent to make such a decision. Go ahead. Try to prove that giving away my own property to help people in need is evidence of mental incompetence. I'd like to see how that argument plays in court. You've been isolated and depressed since Dad died. You've been living alone in this enormous house with no social contact except for church volunteers. When a stranger shows up offering companionship, you're vulnerable to manipulation, even if you don't recognize it." Clara felt something break inside her chest. Not grief this time, but disappointment so profound it was almost physical. "Get out," she said quietly. "Mom, get out of my house, all of you. If you think I'm mentally incompetent, then hire your lawyers and file your petitions. But don't sit at my table and eat my food while you plan to have me declared unfit to make my own decisions. You're being unreasonable. I'm being honest. For the first time in 18 months, I'm doing something that feels meaningful instead of just safe. If you can't support that, then I don't want your company." Margaret, Michael, and Sarah exchanged glances that spoke of private conversations and shared strategies. Clara recognized the look. It was the same expression they had worn as children when they were planning to circumvent parental authority. "Fine," Margaret said, standing and gathering her purse. "But this isn't over, Mom. We love you too much to let you destroy your life and our family's legacy because you're lonely and grieving. And I love you too much to let you control my life because you're afraid of losing an inheritance you never earned." After they left, Clara stood in her dining room surrounded by the detritus of a family meal that had become a declaration of War. The fine china she had inherited from her own mother, the silver that had been a wedding gift, the crystal glasses that had toasted decades of celebrations. All of it suddenly felt like costumes for a play she no longer wanted to perform. Jack appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "How much did you hear?" "Enough to know that they're planning to fight this legally." "Are you prepared for that? For months of court proceedings and family drama and public scrutiny of your personal life?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, considering. Not just the question, but the weight of responsibility that came with it. "Clara, are you sure this is what you want?" "Really sure. Because once this fight begins, it's going to get ugly, and there won't be an easy way to back down." Clara looked around the dining room that had hosted thousands of meals, hundreds of celebrations, decades of ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but now felt precious beyond measure. "I've never been more sure of anything. This house was meant to be a home, not a museum." Robert understood that, and now I understand it too. Even if it costs you your relationship with your children, especially if it costs me that. Because if they only love me when I make choices they approve of, then maybe what I thought was love was actually just ownership. As evening settled over the mansion, Clara and Jack worked together to clear away the remnants of the disastrous lunch. The familiar routine of washing dishes and putting away silver felt like a return to normalcy after the afternoon's emotional chaos. But Clara knew that nothing would be normal again. By Monday, Margaret would have consulted with lawyers about challenging the donation. By the end of the week, there would likely be court papers filed questioning Clara's mental competence and seeking to block the transfer of the house. It would be a public battle fought in newspapers and legal briefs, with Clara's fitness as a parent and her capacity for rational decision-making dissected by strangers who had never met her. But for tonight, she was still in her own home, preparing for bed with the knowledge that she had finally done something Robert would be proud of. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight was hers to savor. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, Clara realized that she felt lighter than she had in months. The weight of her children's expectations, the burden of maintaining appearances, the exhausting effort of being the person everyone wanted her to be, all of it was gone, replaced by the simple clarity of knowing she was doing the right thing, regardless of the cost. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and photographers, their cameras clicking like mechanical insects as Clara emerged from the black sedan that had brought her downtown for the formal transfer ceremony. News of her decision to donate a multi-million-dollar mansion to help homeless individuals had spread through the community like wildfire, dividing public opinion between those who saw her as a saint and those who suspected senility. Margaret, Michael, and Sarah stood with their lawyers on the opposite side of the courthouse entrance, their faces set in expressions of grim determination. They had filed emergency motions to block the transfer, claiming that Clara was not mentally competent to make such a significant financial decision. The hearing on their petition was scheduled for the following week, but today's ceremony would proceed as planned unless the judge granted an immediate injunction. Clara wore the same navy suit she had chosen for confronting her children, but today she had added her grandmother's pearl necklace and her mother's gold bracelet, talismans of strength from women who had faced their own difficult decisions with grace and courage. Jack walked beside her, wearing the only suit he owned, a charcoal gray outfit that had seen better days, but still carried itself with dignity. The house keys hung from Robert's keychain in his jacket pocket, their weight both literal and symbolic of the responsibility he was about to accept. "Are you ready for this?" Clara asked as they climbed the courthouse steps, ignoring the shouted questions from reporters about her mental state and her motivations for such an extraordinary gift. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and discover this was all an elaborate dream," Jack replied, but his voice was steady and his step sure. Inside the courthouse, The small ceremonial room was packed with representatives from the Riverside Homeless Coalition, legal observers, and community members who had followed the story in the local newspaper. Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver hair, presided over the proceedings with the careful attention to detail that such an unusual case required. Mrs. Whitmore, Judge Morrison said once everyone was seated, "I've reviewed the documents filed in this case, including the emergency petition from your children, claiming that you lack the mental capacity to complete this donation. I've also reviewed the independent psychiatric evaluation you underwent last week at your attorney's request." Clara nodded. The evaluation had been her lawyer's idea, a preemptive strike against her children's claims of incompetence. Dr. Helen Rodriguez, a respected psychiatrist with 30 years of experience, had spent 4 hours with Clara, administering cognitive tests and conducting detailed interviews about her decision-making process and understanding of the consequences. Dr. Rodriguez's report indicates that you are fully competent, cognitively intact, and capable of understanding the implications of your decision to donate this property. She found no evidence of dementia, depression severe enough to impair judgment or undue influence from any third party. Margaret's lawyer, a sharp-featured man in an expensive suit, rose from his seat. "Your Honor, we respectfully submit that a single psychiatric evaluation cannot adequately assess the complex psychological factors that might lead a 63-year-old widow to give away her family home to a stranger. She's known for less than 2 months," noted counsel. "However, I find Dr. Rodriguez's evaluation to be thorough and credible. More importantly, I find Mrs. Whitmore herself to be articulate, thoughtful, and entirely capable of explaining her reasoning for this donation." Judge Morrison turned her attention directly to Clara. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm required to ask you several questions to ensure that this transfer is being made freely and with full understanding of its consequences. Do you understand that by completing this donation, you are giving up ownership of property valued at approximately $2.8 million? "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you understand that this decision will significantly reduce the inheritance that your children might otherwise expect to receive?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you understand that while the trust provides you with housing and a monthly stipend, you will have limited access to the equity currently represented by this property?" "I understand completely, Your Honor. The apartment provided by the trust meets all my needs, and the monthly stipend is more than adequate for my remaining expenses." "Have you been pressured, threatened, or coerced by anyone in making this decision?" Clara's eyes found Jack in the crowd, noting the careful way he watched the proceedings without trying to influence them in any direction. "No, Your Honor. This decision is entirely my own." "Mrs. Whitmore, would you explain to the court why you have chosen to make this donation?" Clara stood, though the judge hadn't required it. She felt the weight of everyone's attention, the skepticism of her children's legal team, the hope of the homeless advocates, the curiosity of the reporters who would turn her words into tomorrow's headlines. "Your Honor, my late husband Robert established this charitable trust because he believed that our good fortune came with an obligation to help those less fortunate. He left me the choice of when to complete the donation because he trusted my judgment and wanted me to act when I felt the time was right." "And you believe the time is right now?" "Yes, Your Honor. Through circumstances I can only describe as providential, I met Mr. Patterson at exactly the moment when I was struggling with feelings of loneliness and purposelessness. In helping him, I rediscovered a sense of meaning that I had lost after my husband's death." "Can you elaborate on what you mean by providential circumstances?" Clara chose her words carefully, aware that anything too metaphysical might support her children's claims about impaired judgment. "I mean that Mr. Patterson appeared at my door at precisely the time when I needed to understand what my husband had been trying to tell me through his estate planning. His presence helped me see that this house could serve a purpose far greater than simply providing shelter for one lonely person. Margaret's lawyer rose again. Your Honor, Mrs. Whitmore's own words support our contention that she is making this decision based on emotional impulse rather than rational consideration of her long-term interests. Judge Morrison's expression sharpened. Counsel, are you suggesting that charitable impulses are evidence of mental incompetence? I'm suggesting that giving away one's entire estate to help a stranger is not the action of someone thinking clearly about practical considerations. Mrs. Whitmore is not giving away her entire estate. She is completing a donation that her husband planned and that provides adequately for her remaining needs. The fact that she is motivated by compassion rather than self-interest does not constitute evidence of impaired judgment. Clara felt a surge of gratitude toward Judge Morrison, whose questions had been probing but fair, and whose responses to the opposing counsel suggested sympathy for Clara's position. Mr. Patterson, the judge continued, you have been appointed as the initial property manager for this transitional housing facility. Do you understand the responsibilities this position entails? Jack stood, his posture straight despite the years of homelessness that had taught him to make himself invisible. Yes, Your Honor. I'll be responsible for maintaining the physical property, coordinating with social services to help residents transition to independent housing, and ensuring that the facility operates according to the standards established by the Riverside Homeless Coalition. Do you feel prepared to handle these responsibilities? I have 30 years of experience in construction and property maintenance, and 8 years of personal experience with homelessness. I understand both the practical needs of the facility and the challenges faced by the people it will serve. Have you made any promises to Mrs. Whitmore regarding how this property will be managed, or have you requested any special considerations in exchange for your acceptance of this position? No, Your Honor. Mrs. Whitmore made this decision based on her understanding of her husband's wishes and her own values. My role is to honor her gift by ensuring that it serves its intended purpose as effectively as possible. Judge Morrison made notes on her legal pad, then looked up at the assembled crowd. This court finds that Mrs. Clara Whitmore is mentally competent to make decisions regarding her property, that she understands the consequences of her decision to complete this charitable donation, and that she is acting freely without coercion or undue influence from any party. Margaret's face flushed with anger and frustration, while her lawyer whispered urgently in her ear about appeal options and alternative legal strategies. Therefore, Judge Morrison continued, I hereby approve the transfer of the property located at 1247 Riverside Drive from Mrs. Clara Whitmore to the Robert and Clara Whitmore Charitable Trust, to be operated by the Riverside Homeless Coalition as a transitional housing facility. The courtroom erupted in applause from the coalition supporters, while Margaret, Michael, and Sarah sat in stunned silence. Clara felt tears of relief and gratitude streaming down her face as the judge's gavel made the transfer official. Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Patterson, please approach the bench for the ceremonial transfer of property ownership. They walked forward together, Clara carrying the deed that had been in her family for decades, Jack carrying the ring of keys that Robert had used to lock and unlock doors that would now serve an entirely different purpose. Mrs. Whitmore, by signing this document, you are officially transferring ownership of your property to the charitable trust established by your husband. Clara signed her name with the same fountain pen Robert had used for 40 years of important documents. As her signature dried on the paper, she felt a profound sense of completion, as if she were finally fulfilling a promise she had made not just to Robert, but to her younger self who had believed that love and generosity could change the world. Mr. Patterson, by accepting these keys, you are accepting responsibility for ensuring that this property serves its intended purpose of helping homeless individuals transition to stable housing. Jack took the keys with hands that weren't entirely steady. The metal was warm from his pocket, worn smooth by years of Robert's daily use. "I accept this responsibility, Your Honor, and I promise to honor both Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore's vision for what this place can become." As they walked back down the courthouse steps, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions, Clara felt a lightness she hadn't experienced since Robert's death. The mansion was no longer hers, but for the first time since becoming a widow, she felt truly free. The final rose of the season bloomed in Robert's garden on the day Clara packed her last suitcase. She had noticed the bud forming weeks ago, a deep red hybrid tea rose that Robert had planted in their 10th year of marriage, one that typically finished blooming by late August, but had somehow managed one last flower for early October. Clara cut the rose carefully, its stem long and strong, its petals perfect, despite the cool nights that had claimed most of its companions. She would press it between the pages of Robert's favorite book of poetry, the one she was taking to her new apartment along with his reading glasses and the wooden bird Jack had carved for her. The moving truck had left that morning, taking a carefully selected collection of furniture and personal items to the senior housing complex where Clara would begin the next phase of her life. The movers had been efficient and respectful, treating her possessions with the care of people who understood that each box represented decades of accumulated memories. But the real goodbye was happening now, in the quiet hour between the movers' departure and her own, when she could walk through each room of the mansion one final time without the distraction of logistics and schedules. She started in the kitchen, where she had cooked thousands of meals and shared hundreds of conversations with Jack over the past 2 months. The room would soon be converted into a commercial-grade facility capable of feeding 20 residents at a time. But Clara could still see it as it had been, Robert reading the morning paper at the table by the window, steam rising from his coffee cup, sunlight streaming through curtains she had sewn herself during their 2nd year of marriage. The dining room held the ghost of last night's farewell dinner, when representatives from the Riverside Homeless Coalition had joined Clara and Jack for a meal in the space that would soon host community meetings and celebration dinners for people who had secured permanent housing. The conversation had been warm and hopeful, focused on the practical details of opening the facility and the screening processes for selecting residents. But Clara had found herself studying the faces around her table, memorizing the way candlelight played across features animated by purpose and genuine care for the work they were undertaking. These were good people, she had realized, people who understood that changing lives required more than good intentions. It demanded patience, expertise, and the kind of sustained commitment that came from deep belief in human dignity. In the living room, Clara paused beside the piano she had played every Sunday evening for 40 years. Robert would sit in his chair with a glass of wine, listening to her work through the pieces they both loved, Bach and Chopin, and the simple hymns that had formed the soundtrack of their shared faith. The piano would stay with the house, its music available to anyone who needed the comfort of familiar melodies or the challenge of learning something new. Robert's study proved the most difficult room to leave. Clara sat in his chair one last time, surrounded by the books he would never finish and the projects he had planned but would never complete. His reading glasses lay on the desk exactly where he had left them, but now they seemed less like abandonment and more like invitation, an offer for someone else to see clearly, to read widely, to engage with ideas that could change the world. The photographs on his desk told the story of their life together, their wedding day, when they were young and convinced that love could overcome any obstacle. Their children's graduations and weddings, celebrations of accomplishments that had filled them with pride. Vacation pictures from the trips they had taken to celebrate anniversaries and recovery from illness. Each image represented a moment when they had been completely present to their happiness, completely convinced that their good fortune would continue indefinitely. But the photograph that drew Clara's attention now was one she had forgotten about, a picture of her and Robert at a charity fundraiser from 15 years ago. both of them holding oversized checks representing donations to the local homeless shelter. Robert was grinning at the camera, but Clara was looking at him with the expression of someone who had just fallen in love all over again with the man she had married. She remembered that night clearly now. They had been asked to speak about their motivation for giving, and Robert had surprised her by telling the audience about the promise they had made on their 10th anniversary. The vow to never let good souls go without shelter if they had the power to help. Clara had been embarrassed by the public attention, but also proud of the man who could articulate values she carried but rarely spoke about. "You were planning this all along, weren't you?" she whispered to his photograph. "You knew that someday I'd need to understand what we promised each other, and you left me breadcrumbs to find my way back to that promise." Upstairs, Clara's bedroom held the weight of 41 years of shared sleep. Shared dreams, shared fears whispered in the darkness when neither of them could rest. The bed where Robert had died on a Tuesday morning in March, his heart giving out so suddenly that he never woke up to say goodbye. The window where Clara had stood for 18 months, looking out at the garden and wondering what to do with a life that suddenly had no clear direction. But today, the bedroom felt different, not like a shrine to loss, but like a place where love had been nurtured and celebrated and allowed to grow into something strong enough to survive even death. Clara packed the last of her personal items into a small suitcase, leaving behind the expensive jewelry and designer clothes that had been costumes for a role. She no longer needed to play. Jack was waiting in the garden when she came downstairs, standing among the roses that had brought them together. And that would soon provide beauty and peace for people who had been too long without either. He had spent the morning making final preparations for the transition-checking irrigation systems, securing tools, creating detailed notes about the care each plant would require through the coming winter. "Are you ready?" he asked, noting the car keys in her hand and the finality in her posture. "I think so. Are you? I keep expecting to wake up and find out this was all an elaborate dream. It's hard to believe that 6 months ago I was sleeping in doorways, and now I'm responsible for managing a facility that can help dozens of people get back on their feet." Clara looked around the garden that had been Robert's passion and Jack's salvation, noting the careful attention to detail that would ensure its beauty long after both of them were gone. "Robert would be so proud of what you've accomplished here. Not just the physical work, but the love you've brought to it. Gardens know when they're truly cared for. I learned from a master. Your husband understood that gardens aren't just about plants. They're about creating spaces where a life can flourish." Clara felt tears threatening as the full weight of what she was leaving behind settled over her. Not just a house, but 40 years of accumulated memories, routines, and connections to the man who had shared those years with her. "Jack, I need you to promise me something. Anything. I need you to promise that you'll remember this place as it was when Robert was alive, full of laughter and conversation and the sound of people who loved each other. But more than that, I need you to help it become that again. Not a museum to what was, but a living home for what could be." Jack nodded, understanding the weight of what she was asking. "I promise. This will be a place where people can heal and hope and remember what it feels like to belong somewhere." Clara handed him the final rose from Robert's garden, its petals still perfect, despite the approaching winter. "This is for you to keep or give away as you see fit. But remember that it came from love, and everything you do here should grow from that same source." Jack accepted the rose with the reverence of someone receiving a sacred trust. "Clara, how can I ever thank you for what you've given me? Not just the house, but the chance to be useful again, to matter to someone, to wake up with purpose instead of just the need to survive another day. You don't need to thank me. You've given me something far more valuable than what I've given." "You? What's that?" "You've shown me that the love Robert and I shared didn't die with him. It just needed a new way to express itself in the world. This house, this work, this community we're creating, It's all an extension of what we built together. They stood in comfortable silence, two people whose lives had intersected at exactly the moment when they both needed to be reminded that kindness could still change everything. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, but there was warmth in the light that promised spring would return, even after the hardest winter. "Will you visit?" Jack asked as Clara prepared to leave for the final time. "Every Sunday for dinner, if you'll have me. I want to see the faces of the people this place helps. I want to hear their stories and celebrate their victories and remind myself why we did this. You'll always be welcome here. This will always be your home, even if you don't live in it anymore." Clara walked to her car slowly, memorizing the sound of gravel under her feet and the way the mansion looked in afternoon light. At the gate, she turned for one last look at the house where she had been a young bride, a new mother, a woman in middle age, and finally a widow learning to live alone. But now she was something else entirely, someone who had chosen purpose over security, community over comfort, hope over the safe preservation of what had already been lost. The woman driving away from 1247 Riverside Drive was different from the one who had invited a homeless stranger in for coffee 2 months earlier. Stronger in some ways, more vulnerable in others, but absolutely certain that she had made the right choice. As Clara's car disappeared around the corner, Jack stood alone in the garden he had brought back to life, holding the rose that represented everything he was being trusted to preserve and protect. Tomorrow, the first residents would arrive, carefully screened individuals, ready to begin the difficult work of rebuilding their lives with the support of social services and the dignity of a beautiful place to call home, even temporarily. But tonight, a mansion was quiet, suspended between what it had been and what it would become. Jack walked through the rooms slowly, noting how different they felt without Clara's presence, but how much warmth remained in the walls that had sheltered love for so many decades. In Robert's study, he found a note Clara had left on the desk, beside the reading glasses. "Jack, thank you for helping me understand that home isn't a place we keep, but a gift we give. Make this house sing again with voices of people who have found their way back to hope. All my love and gratitude, Clara. P.S. The roses will need winter protection by November." Robert's notes are in the filing cabinet under garden care. Take good care of them, and they'll take good care of everyone who lives here. Jack folded the note carefully and placed it in his wallet, next to the photograph of Sarah that had sustained him through 8 years of homelessness. 2 images of love that had shaped his understanding of what it meant to matter to someone, what it meant to have a place in the world that was uniquely his own. As darkness settled over the mansion, Jack turned on lights in every room, not because he needed them all, but because the house deserved to glow with warmth and welcome on this first night of its new purpose. Tomorrow would bring the practical challenges of opening a transitional housing facility, but tonight was for gratitude and the quiet recognition that sometimes the most important journeys begin when we stop trying to get somewhere and start trying to help someone else find their way. The last thing Jack did before going to bed was place Clara's rose in a glass of water on the kitchen windowsill, where it would catch the morning light and remind him every day of the love that had made this transformation possible. Outside, the garden settled into its evening quiet, but it was the peaceful stillness of living things at rest, not the abandoned silence of neglect. For the first time in 8 years, Jack fell asleep in a house that was truly home, not just shelter from the weather, but a place where he belonged, where his presence made a difference, where tomorrow held purpose instead of merely the promise of survival. 1 year later, the welcome mat Jack had placed at the front door of the mansion showed signs of heavy use, scuffed from the footsteps of residents, social workers, volunteers, and visitors who had discovered that 1247 Riverside Drive had become more than a transitional housing facility. It had become a symbol of what was possible when compassion met practical action. The bulletin board Jack had installed in the foyer was covered with photographs, thank you notes, and announcements that told the story of lives being rebuilt. Marcus, a former construction worker who had lost his housing after a workplace injury, had secured a permanent apartment and a new job with the city maintenance department. Linda, a teacher whose mental illness had led to homelessness, was back in the classroom and mentoring other residents through their recovery. James, a veteran struggling with PTSD, had reconnected with his estranged daughter and moved into subsidized housing near her family. Each success story represented months of patient work, setbacks overcome, trust rebuilt, and hope restored. But the board also displayed practical information job training opportunities, apartment listings, mental health resources, addiction recovery programs that reflected Jack's understanding that changing lives required more than good intentions. Clara arrived every Sunday at 4 o'clock for dinner, a tradition that had evolved from weekly visits to the cornerstone of the mansion's community calendar. Residents who were comfortable with social interaction joined them in the dining room, sharing stories and celebrating small victories over meals prepared in the commercial kitchen that had replaced Clara's domestic version. Today's dinner conversation centered around Thomas, a 54-year-old former accountant whose gambling addiction had cost him his career, his marriage, and eventually his housing. He had been living at the mansion for 6 months, working with counselors and slowly rebuilding his relationship with his teenage son. "I got a call from my boy yesterday," Thomas said, his voice careful with the weight of unexpected hope. "He wants to visit next weekend. First time he's been willing to see me in 3 years." The table erupted in quiet congratulations, not the loud celebration that might make Thomas uncomfortable, but the warm acknowledgement of people who understood how hard it was to earn back trust once it had been lost. "Will you be nervous?" asked Maria, a young mother who had been homeless after fleeing an abusive relationship and was now preparing to move into her own apartment with her 5-year-old son. "Terrified," Thomas admitted, "but the good kind of terrified, if that makes sense, like when you're scared because something really matters." Clara smiled, recognizing the feeling he described. A year ago, she had been terrified to make the decision that transformed both their lives, but it had been the kind of fear that came with knowing you were about to do something that would matter forever. After dinner, Clara walked through the mansion with Jack, noting the changes that had accumulated over 12 months of operation. The living room furniture had been replaced with sturdy pieces that could withstand daily use by multiple residents, but the space still felt warm and welcoming. The library that had been Robert's domain now served as a quiet study area where residents could work on job applications, complete GED coursework, or simply read for pleasure. Most remarkably, Robert's workshop in the basement had been transformed into a carpentry training program that Jack operated twice a week. Men and women who had lost confidence in their ability to contribute anything useful learned to build birdhouses, repair furniture, and create simple woodworking projects that restored their sense of competence along with their practical skills. "You should see tomorrow's class," Jack told Clara as they stood in the workshop surrounded by half-finished projects. "We're building planter boxes for the community garden. Thomas designed them. Turns out he's got an eye for that kind of thing." Clara picked up a hand plane that had been Robert's favorite tool, noting how the wood handle had been polished smooth by decades of use. Now other hands were learning to guide it. Other people were discovering the satisfaction that came from shaping raw materials into something beautiful and useful. "Robert would love this," she said. "He always said that working with your hands was a form of prayer, a way of participating in the ongoing creation of the world." I think about him often when I'm teaching. I can almost hear his voice sometimes, correcting my technique or suggesting a better way to approach a problem. The mansion's guest rooms now served rotating 3-month residencies for people transitioning from emergency shelter to independent housing. Each room was furnished simply but comfortably, with space for personal belongings and privacy for processing the trauma that had led to homelessness. The house rules were minimal but firm: no drugs or alcohol, respect for other residents and staff, participation in individual counseling and life skills programming, and contribution to household maintenance according to ability. But the real success of the program came from something harder to quantify: the sense of dignity that residents experienced from living in a beautiful place, where they were treated as human beings with potential rather than problems to be managed. "The waiting list is getting longer," Jack told Clara as they climbed the main staircase to the second floor. "We're getting referrals from all over the region, people who have heard about what we're doing here and want to be part of it. Are you overwhelmed? Some days? But then I remember how it felt to be invisible, to have people look right through me like I didn't exist. And I know that even if we can only help 20 people at a time, those 20 people matter." Clara's own transition to apartment living had been easier than she had expected. The senior housing complex was well designed and well managed, and her neighbors were interesting people with rich life experiences and stories worth hearing. She had joined the book club, volunteered to teach piano lessons to children in the community center, and discovered that a smaller space required less maintenance and left more time for activities that actually interested her. But more than that, Clara had discovered that she enjoyed being accountable to a community rather than isolated in private luxury. Her neighbors checked on her when she was ill, celebrated her birthday with homemade cake, and included her in their informal networks of mutual support. The relationships were different from family bonds, but no less meaningful. Connections based on choice and compatibility rather than obligation and history. Her children remained cordially distant, sending birthday cards and calling on holidays, but never discussing the decision that had permanently altered their relationship. Margaret had eventually dropped the legal challenge to the donation, perhaps recognizing that the publicity was making her appear petty and greedy. Michael and Sarah had followed suit, choosing to preserve what relationship they could rather than escalate the conflict further. Clara missed them, of course. She missed the grandchildren she rarely saw now, missed the family gatherings that had marked holidays and celebrations for decades. But she didn't regret the choice that had cost her their approval. The work being done at the mansion, the lives being changed and restored, the community being built from the foundation of Robert's vision, all of it validated her decision every day. As winter approached again, marking the anniversary of Jack's arrival at her gates, Clara reflected on how much had changed for both of them. The desperate man, who had been homeless for 8 years, now managed a staff of 4, oversaw a budget of several $100,000, and had been featured in a magazine article about innovative approaches to addressing homelessness. More personally, Jack had developed a relationship with Eleanor, a social worker who collaborated with the mansion's programs, and who shared his understanding of how difficult it could be to rebuild a life after losing everything. They had been dating for 6 months, taking things slowly but with the mature awareness of people who had learned not to take love for granted. "Eleanor wants to meet you officially," Jack told Clara as they stood in the garden where winter preparations were already underway. "I mean, she's met you at events and dinners, but she wants to have a real conversation about the work we're doing and how it might expand. Is she thinking about joining the staff?" "She's thinking about a lot of things. About whether there's room in her life for someone with my history. About whether she could be happy living in a place where privacy is limited and emotional crises are part of the daily routine." Clara studied Jack's face, noting the happiness there, but also the vulnerability of someone who had learned to expect disappointment. "What do you think?" "I think Eleanor is the kind of person who makes difficult situations better just by being present. And I think she understands that some kinds of work require your whole heart, not just your professional expertise. Then I think you should invite her to Sunday dinner, officially." As Clara prepared to leave that evening, she paused. In the foyer beside the bulletin board that documented the mansion's first year of operation, mixed among the success stories and practical announcements, was a new addition, a photograph of the mansion's current residents gathered on the front steps for a group picture. 20 people of various ages and backgrounds, some smiling confidently, others still showing the wariness that came with recent trauma, but all of them clean and fed and housed in dignity. In the center of the group stood Jack, no longer the desperate man who had appeared at Clara's gates, but someone whose presence radiated competence and compassion. At the bottom of the photograph, someone had written in careful script, "Home is where people see your potential instead of your problems." Clara drove back to her apartment that evening with the satisfaction of someone whose life had found its proper purpose. The decision to give away her mansion had cost her relationships and financial security, but it had given her something more valuable, the knowledge that Robert's love continued to work in the world long after his death, and that her own capacity for courage had been larger than she had ever imagined. At her kitchen table that night, Clara opened the journal she had been keeping since the donation was completed. Tonight's entry was brief but profound. November 15th, 1 year since the mansion opened. 20 people housed, 14 successfully transitioned to permanent housing, 6 still in residence working toward independence. Jack thriving in his role as property manager and program coordinator. Eleanor seems lovely and genuinely interested in the work. I am happier than I have been since Robert died, not because I've forgotten my grief, but because I've found a way to transform it into something that serves life instead of just preserving memory. Robert would be proud. I think not just of what we've built, but of how we've built it with respect for human dignity, attention to practical needs, and the understanding that everyone deserves a chance to start again when life has knocked them down. Tomorrow, Jack starts a new carpentry class for women residents. Maria is excited to learn skills that might help her support her son independently. Thomas's son is visiting again next weekend, his second visit in 2 months. The rose garden is dormant now, but Jack assures me the roots are strong in spring. Will bring new growth. I'm learning that home isn't something you keep, but something you create over and over again, each time you choose to make space for someone else to belong. The final photograph in Clara's journal showed her and Jack standing together in Robert's garden on the day she moved out, both of them holding the rose that had symbolized the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Behind them, the mansion rose against a sky full of possibility, no longer a monument to what had been lost, but a promise of what love could build when it was given room to grow. Outside Clara's apartment window, the city settled into its evening rhythm, full of people seeking shelter, connection, and the basic human dignity of having a place to call home. Some would find it easily, others would struggle, but a few would make their way to 1247 Riverside Drive, where they would discover that sometimes the most important doors are opened not by keys, but by the simple recognition that everyone deserves a chance to matter to someone. In the mansion's garden, dormant roses waited for spring, their roots deep and strong, ready to bloom again when the time was right. Just like the people who had found shelter there, just like the friendships that had grown from desperate need and generous response, just like the love that had survived death and transformed itself into something that would outlast them all. The welcome mat by the front door would greet many more footsteps, many more stories, many more chances for lives to intersect in ways that changed everything. And somewhere in the foundations of that grand old house, the echo of a promise made 40 years ago continued to resonate. Never let a good soul go without shelter when you have the power to help. That promise, Clara knew as she prepared for sleep in her small apartment, was the only inheritance that truly mattered. Not money or property or social position, but the commitment to see potential instead of problems, to offer hope instead of judgment, to build home wherever love was, willing to take root and grow.